preaching to the choir, but I feel like I should say it. Do you guys know that phrase? I always say Texas phrases and people don't know. Like going around your ass to get to your elbow, that's like taking a long way. Preaching to the choir. It's a great one. I'm like, people in Utah, they're like, what did you just say? I'm like, I'm sorry that you did not have as many good floral language as I did growing up. But preaching to the choir, today is the last day to drop with 100% free fund. So I know that you guys are here, and I'm not telling you to drop. Just if you did, get your money back. That's all I'm saying. So if you have a buddy that you haven't seen in 3 weeks and you like them and know that they're not independently wealthy, shoot them a text and say, today's the day to drop. Where the hell is everybody anyway? Like 3 raindrops, and you're like, well, apparently I'm staying home. You should have told me, so I could have too, because I like to nap in this weather with my snuggly puppies. Okay. Superfly said hi, by the way. Okay. So let's finish up this set of notes, and then we'll start on skeletal system. Your test is scheduled for week after next, yeah? And it will have 3 sets of notes, which is just anatomical terminology, all that stuff, histology, a bunch of histology because it takes forever to get through, and then skeletal system. And we'll talk about how I test you on skeletal system once we start it today. And even though we'll start muscle before that, I never test you over something that you haven't already had in lab, right? So you will have had all of this stuff in lab, and then you'll be tested over it. All right, so the last thing that I need to do on this set of notes is just talk to start moving up away from histology into talking about organs. Because you guys have done levels of organization many times before, right? And you know that what comes after cells is tissues, and what comes after tissues is organs. So an organ is what? What is it? Yeah, a group of tissues functioning together. It really only has to be 2 tissues functioning together. So although it's counterintuitive, even 2 different tissues could actually be an organ. And we will actually see the simplest organs at the end of this set of notes. So what we're going to do right now is we're just going to sort of, instead of do memorization, we're going to try to predict and figure out and understand, because you know enough about tissues to know that if we looked at any hollow organ, let's just think about it, any hollow organ, this could be the esophagus or the small intestine or, you know, the uterine tube, doesn't matter what it is, right? Any hollow organ, you can tell me that the tissue that would be closest to the lumen would be a what?
Epithelial.
It would be an epithelial tissue, right? But then, because you are brilliant and you can start to put together information and make connections, you would also be able to tell me that if the epithelial tissue was really thick, it would be more likely to be functioning how? Protection. If it was really thin, it would be more likely to be doing transport or secretion, in or out, whatever, right? Okay. If it had microvilli, what does that tell you? Gonna be really good at transport or absorption. What if it had cilia? And we get moving something over, right? So what will happen all semester long, although you'll hate every damn minute of it, and all of my students do, is that when we get to every single body system, I will hold you responsible for the tissue again, right? We get to cardiovascular system, I'm gonna say, oh, you need to go back and look at that cardiac muscle slide, because now we start to put together structure with function, right? This is all arbitrary at this point, doesn't mean very much to you, but there is a lot of meaning in it. So what type of tissue you have here will matter, but then you also know to predict that immediately deep to the epithelial tissue, in any hollow organ, you should find what? Connective tissue, yeah? And then you can think about what kind of connective tissue. A stronger organ, or an organ that needed more strength, would be more likely to have which? A reeler or dense irregular? Yeah, exactly. So you can start to think about what the organ has in the wall, and it tells you what it needs, right? And then deep to that, you're going to run into muscle. If it's any hollow organ except the heart, it's going to be what kind of muscle? Smooth muscle, yeah. Okay, any hollow organ except the heart is going to be smooth muscle. Everybody good with that? And if I have 3 thick layers versus 1 thin layer of smooth muscle, which one do you think it probably moves around, solids or liquids? 3 thick layers versus 1 thin layer. Solids, yes. So what do you imagine about the thickness of your stomach versus the thickness of your small intestine. Much thicker, smooth muscle layers. Does that make sense to you guys? So there's meaning here is what I'm telling you. It's not just arbitrary. You can actually look at it. And then you move out to the outside. As you move to the other side of the muscle, you're going to run into connective tissue again. Yes? Okay. And then what you run into on the surface depends on whether the organ is hanging out by itself or stuck to a buddy. If it's hanging out by itself, you're going to run into an epithelial tissue. Yeah? Good? But a lot of organs are actually stuck and adhered to one another. So if it's stuck to another organ, then it's not going to be epithelial tissue on the surface. It's going to be what? Connective tissue on the surface. Does that make sense to you guys? Right? And so you can actually, when you start getting into the histology and actually looking at body systems, I will try to point out and make these connections to you, but I'm also asking you to do your best to take this subject, which is really hard to apply for most people, which is histology, and start looking for meaning in it as we visit it all semester long. So basically, inside of every epithelial tissue is called, or inside of every hollow organ is an epithelial tissue. It's usually called a mucosa if it's a moist membrane, right? Mucous membrane secretes mucus, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. If it has any modifications, you try to think about what they are. If it's got cilia versus microvilli or whatever, or goblet cells. And then there's going to be a basement membrane. Then deep to that, there's going to be a connective tissue. What kind? Deep to the connective tissue, muscle, how thick, what orientation. It can tell you what it does, right? And then on the superficial side, on the very outside of the organ, as I mentioned, you can either run into an epithelial tissue on the surface. If it's in the ventral body cavity, the epithelial tissue would be the surface of the serous membrane, which we would call serosa, right? But if it's connective tissue, they actually call it a word that you haven't met yet, which is adventitia. And it's not as confusing as you think. It just means that it has superficial connective tissue because it's probably stuck to something else, right? And I'll point this term out to you as we go through the semester, right? I'll remind you that we have either serosa or adventitia on the surface. Which one is this? And you're like, oh, it's connective tissue. That's adventitia. It's probably stuck to something, right? Okay. So now, the simplest organs, as I mentioned, only have 2 layers of tissues, right? 2 will make a tissue. And they don't even look like organs. The simplest organ that you have already met is actually a serous membrane. And a serous membrane, it sounds counterintuitive, but what I'm telling you is the liver is an organ with an organ on top, because a serous membrane is made of 2 layers of tissue, connective and then epithelial. Good? Okay. The connective tissue is areolar, which is the most common connective tissue that you're going to run into. And the epithelial tissue is a modified simple squamous it is raining hard. A modified simple squamous epithelium that has secretory capacity, right? You didn't learn that one in histology slides because it's kind of weird looking because it has secretory capacity. It's protective, but it doesn't actually need to be thick to be protective because it's lubricated. Does that make sense? Okay. So, secretory.
Secretes.
As in secretes. Secretes, secretory capacity. So, you guys know that serous membranes are lining your ventral body cavities, right, and the organs within them. And you know that there's actually 4 different sheets of serous membrane, right? The entire organ, sounds weird, that lines your abdominopelvic cavity is an organ called the peritoneum, right? And you know, although it doesn't sound very important, and of course it doesn't look very impressive because it's clear, can that cause you problems if that organ's pissed? Yeah, it totally can, right? And the organ that lines your heart organ is called the pericardium. And if that one goes bad on you, you can have hella problems, right? Okay. And then you've got an organ that lines each of your lungs called the pleura, right? Left and right pleura, right? Both visceral and parietal. So it's just this big sheet. But it gets to be an organ because it's 2 layers of tissue. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. And pleurisy, interestingly, pleurisy is actually kind of going around right now. There's some kind of respiratory thing. I thought it was just my kid who was rando kid who managed to get pneumonia in the hottest part of the year. But he has it. It's going around his school. Some kids have pleurisy. Are you guys running into this too?
Yeah.
What the hell's going on?
I don't know, but we've had a lot.
I know vaping is some of it.
Smoke in the air too.
Yeah,
A
smoke
lot
in
of
the air.
forest fires.
Well, vaping, you know, so far 5 people have died because they are putting some kind of new aerosolizer into vape. I read the CDC report yesterday. And the aerosolizer, this is what they think as of yesterday. Just in case you think about vaping today, don't do it. The aerosolizer is a vitamin E oil base, and the oil helps it to aerosolize. Vitamin E is totally fine for you to take in this way or to eat, yeah? But when you aerosolize it and then it becomes solid again in your lungs, it causes an inflammatory disorder. And it's really hard to clear out of the lungs because it's not water soluble. And so 5 people have died and a whole bunch of people have been hospitalized. Oh, the whole FDA? I thought it was just state by state. Oh, I didn't hear that one. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's causing a lot more problems than they imagined. It was the additives that they're causing. Go ahead.
So the serous membranes, are there only those 3 or those 3 main ones?
There's 4, because there's 2 of these. But yes, there are only these 4. Good? Yeah? Because in the other body cavities, it's got a different kind of membrane that we're not going to learn about yet. And they're called meninges. We'll learn about them later. Yeah? Okay, so let's go on to a different kind of membrane. These are called mucous membranes. And this is what you're pissing off with your vaping. Okay? Mucous membranes are moist membranes that are exposed to the outside of the body, at least theoretically, right? So a mucous membrane would be moist, but you could stick your finger, right, down your, if it was long enough, down your entire respiratory tract until it got into your lungs, right? Down your entire digestive tract until it comes out the other end. That's all a mucous membrane. Urogenital tract is all mucous membranes as well, okay? Now, with a mucous membrane, they're moist, they're exposed to the outside of the body. They're also really clinically important, yes, because they are the most common route for pathogens to enter the body, yeah? Because they're generally hospitable to transport at some point along their route, because that's usually why they're open to the outside of the body. And if you're hospitable to transport, do you think you can be impervious to pathogens and toxins?
No.
No, you can't. So where do you get most of your opportunistic infections? Digestive, respiratory, urogenital, right? That's what's going on there, okay? So they're important. Go ahead.
So isn't the point of the mucus to actually slow that from happening down as well?
It does, but it's not perfect, right? And it's not impervious. But without the mucus and without the protections, we would have it far worse than we do. But it's definitely, it's just not impermeable. So let's talk about this big picture understanding. So let's just talk about the digestive tract, because you guys can think about the digestive tract, right? As the digestive tract goes from the proximal end to the distal end, the epithelial tissue on the surface will change tissue types, because what you do as you move through changes tissue types. Now, I'm not asking you to memorize this. I'm asking you to just think it through, right? Think it through based on your histology knowledge. As you're in the proximal end of your digestive tract, both your oral cavity and your esophagus, are you doing much transport in and out across the epithelial membrane? No, you're not. So you need what? Protection. What kind of tissue do you put there? Moist. Stratified squamous epithelium. Okay. Then at the distal end, you're not doing much protection anymore either. You're just trying to get the poop out. What do you have at that end? Same. No, you're doing protection. Distal end, poop chute, anus, rectum. What do you have down there? Moist stratified squamous epithelium. Good. Okay. But then as you get into your stomach, it's going to change tissue types. Here it's not really doing absorption, but it's doing a hell of a lot of secretion of all of those acids that help break down your food. That's a different kind of epithelial tissue. You didn't learn it yet, but I'll bet you it's not moist stratified squamous epithelium, right? But then once you get into your small intestine, you're doing boatloads of absorption. What kind of tissue do you think you're going to find there? Yeah. Columnar epithelium, simple columnar epithelium with microvilli, right? Okay. And then you start changing tissue types again as you go through the large intestine, because it's mostly about lipid and water reabsorption instead of about that kind of stuff. So what I'm telling you is not to memorize the tissue that's on the superficial surface of a mucous membrane, but to look at it and try to figure out what it has to do with the function of the organ. So this is a mucous membrane too, yeah? So as I'm going down my respiratory tract, the mucous membrane, on the superficial surface, what kind of cells do I have or tissue do I have in the proximal portion?
Moist stratified.
No, respiratory tract. Ciliated, pseudostratified, right? But then as you go down into the surfaces of your alveoli, I'm less about mucus and protections and mucus elevator and more about transport. What are alveoli made of? The most transporty of the transporty. Simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium. Okay, but regardless of what mucous membranes you're looking at, if it's protective, it's more likely to be moist stratified. And then most common is some type of columnar. Doesn't have to be. It's going to have a basement a membrane, and then almost all of your mucous membranes have a reeler right under them. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's what a mucous membrane is, and these end up being really important. They're also really variable. And then last but not least, you guys did it in lab. We don't do it until after muscle because you need more help from me with bone and muscle than you do skin, I promise. But let's acknowledge that skin, or the cutaneous membrane, is an organ. Yes? And it's an organ that you already know the tissues of. Okay? Don't look, just tell me. The superficial epithelial tissue on skin is made of what type of tissue? Keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Then a basement membrane. And then a combination underneath of two connective tissues. What are they? Areolar and dense irregular. Dense irregular. Adipose is not part of skin, it's subcutaneous. Yeah? It's actually not considered part of the skin. Does that make sense? But this is an organ. So the skin is actually an organ. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so then of course we're going to move into bone. But first off, I want to tell you that, like, as far as the rabbit hole goes here, this is just stuff that I think is interesting if you want to go down the rabbit hole. This is the college I used to teach at. They have a good histology page with printable flashcards. So if you don't like the ones that you have, or you want some extra ones, a little more variability, you can totally use those. There's a TED Ed video. TED Ed videos are usually 5 to 7 minutes long. This one's super cool because they use some really good visual technology to take you into the histology of the human body. And then some of you guys are interested in cancer, either for personal or for academic reasons. There is, of course, the people who diagnose cancer by biopsies are pathologists, right? And they are really just badass histologists who know what normal versus abnormal tissues look like. This pathologist has a fantastic site in which he takes you through the tissues and then shows you what an abnormal version of the tissue would look like. I will not test over it, but it's interesting, right? So it's pretty cool if you want to actually look at that. It also has some infectious diseases and crap on it. I like that. That's cool. Okay, so now we are going to move to skeletal system. And here's our friend to give us an introduction. Did you notice how much he looks like Sid? Which vertebra is that, guys? Yeah, that's cervical. How do you know? Yeah, transverse foramina tells you it's cervical vertebra. Later on, you will figure out that the transverse foramina are important in cervical vertebra because you have vertebral arteries and vertebral veins that go to and from your head through those holes. Yeah? So you will actually figure that out. It's pretty important to get blood vessels to your brain for some odd reason. I don't know why. Okay, so what we are going to do is start with the skeletal system. But I have to tell you that when we do skeletal system in lecture, we study some stuff that's the same as lab and also some other stuff, right? So the skeletal system in your lecture text actually has 4 chapters. Chapter 6, which is organization, understanding, and development of the skeleton. They don't do that in lab, not to much degree, okay? I will do it. I will show you how you got a skeleton, what you were before you actually had a skeleton, how it develops, how it changes as you age. We'll talk about osteoporosis, talk about all that kind of stuff in lecture, okay? So that's chapter 6, and we do a lot of chapter 6. Chapter 7 and 8, you have been using to study for lab, because chapter 7 is axial skeleton, and chapter 8 is appendicular skeleton. Lots of pictures. Nobody ever reads those damn chapters. You just look at the damn pictures and don't even try to tell me that you do, because I don't really believe you, okay? So we don't do a whole lot of trying to teach you 7 and 8 in lecture because it's a waste of time. I can project a picture of the humerus and point out the head and the radial groove. It won't do you a damn bit of good. You know what has to happen, right? You have to go into lab, you have to flip the damn thing over 72 times before you actually learn the parts. What I will do is as I go through the rest of teaching you, I will use the bones that you are learning in labs as examples of the things that I am teaching you. So we will reinforce it that way. So how will I test you on skeletal system in 2 weeks when you guys are tested? And I think it's not this Monday, but the Monday after. Like not next Monday, but the Monday after. And you will have all had skeletal system done in lab by then. Everybody will be good. I never test you over anything in lecture until you've already done it in lab, okay? But every single bone and feature that you learn in lab is fair game for a lecture test, okay? And that will force you to hopefully put them together and study them at the same time. It will also force me to use them as examples so that I can use them for instruction. But I have to be reasonable about it, right? Because some things you can't see on a 2D black and white picture. But if you can't find the damn foramen magnum on a black and white picture, you shouldn't pass. Let's be honest, right? Okay? Nobody can find the radial groove half the time when they look at the bone, right? So I'm not going to ask you that one. So you can trust me to ask you things that are easily identifiable on a two-dimensional black and white picture, right? But all of them are fair game, just realizing that I am not trying to fail you. I am trying to give you opportunities to show me that you studied, okay? So all of those bones will potentially be on your lecture test. As far as the lecture test, most of it will be stuff I actually lecture over, but maybe 15% of it will be, hey, did you learn this? Can you put it together, lecture and lab, that kind of stuff? That makes sense? And we'll do something similar with muscle, although I spend a lot of time in lecture trying to help you understand muscles, why they're called that way, how they work, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so everybody understand that? All right, so let's just briefly talk about the functions of the skeleton before we get into some tips for studying bones, because I understand that this is really overwhelming for you guys. So there are some ways to make it clarify a little faster. But first, let's just talk about the basic functions of the skeleton. Because it is supporting connective tissue and it has so much collagen in it, of course it helps you resist gravity and supports you, right? But then in some places, the skeletal system is primarily protective, like here and here, right? But it also has some other ancillary functions, like it produces blood cells. That process is called hemopoiesis. And we'll talk about it. It happens in your red bone marrow. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize until they take a class like this is that your skeleton is actually a bank, a savings account for some minerals that you need to have access to at all times, whether you're starving or not, right? So primarily calcium, but also phosphorus, okay? So what happens is when I eat enough calcium and still have excess, I store it in my skeletal system, right? Okay? When I haven't eaten enough calcium and I need it in my bloodstream, I make a withdrawal from my skeletal system. That ends up being really, really important in the aging process, and we'll talk about osteoporosis later. But basically what happens is as you age, especially in women, for reasons we'll understand, you tend to start either not consuming or not depositing as much calcium. But you need calcium for things that are even arguably more important than your skeleton. You need calcium for blood clotting. You need calcium for cardiac muscle contraction. You need calcium for nervous system transmission. So if I don't have enough, I will take it from my skeletal system. And so what happens in an 85-year-old woman, if she isn't getting adequate calcium in her diet, what does she start to manifest? Osteoporosis, exactly. It's more likely in women than it is in men. It can happen in both sexes, okay? So it is storage of minerals, calcium, and then it is also used as leverage for body movement. So since some of you guys are going to end up starting muscle next week on Wednesday, right? It's the first time that they start muscle. That is the hardest lab of the year. Do not miss it under any circumstances. If you do, you should probably drop, okay? I want to give you a little insight as to how muscles work if you don't already have that, because it's related to this, okay? So your skeleton does not move, but your skeleton provides leverage for body movement. So let me explain to you how that works, okay? talk about a muscle that we all understand or at least have met, which is the deltoid muscle right here, okay? And the deltoid muscle does this, among other things. Everybody with me? So the way that the skeleton and muscles are involved is to use the skeleton as leverage. I'm using these two bones, the clavicle and the scapula, as an immovable point to hold on while I pull a movable point closer to me. So I'm going to hold on right here. I'm going to use it for leverage. I'm going to yank right there, and I'm going to pull it closer to me. So use the skeleton for leverage for body movement. That makes sense? Kind of like if I was standing right here and there was like, I had a rope and something was stuck in the garden, right? And I'm actually going to hold still right here and then pull and try to move that one closer to me. Because all muscles do is contract. They don't ever push. Does that make sense to you guys? So you use the skeleton as leverage. But I want you guys to think about that. Because when you think about that, you can actually start to understand how muscles work before you even understand the name of muscles. So stick with me here for just a second. I have a muscle that is attached up here, okay, and then it is attached down here. If I tell you that this is the fixed point of attachment that doesn't move, and this is the movable one, what should happen when I contract this muscle? Yes, I should raise my leg. Does that make sense? Okay. Now I'm going to do a movement, and you guys are going to try to point to me. It's going to be hard. You're going to get it wrong. It'll be okay. You're going to try to point out to me where you think the attachments are in the skeleton. Okay. You don't have to be exact. I just want like general locations. Ready? I'm going to do a movement. So first I want you to try to tell me where the fixed point is and then where the movable point is. So fixed point first. Here is the movement. Where is the fixed point of attachment that is responsible for that? Oh my gosh, somebody got it right. The rest of you keep trying. Don't tell them. Don't tell them. It's mechanics. You're just yanking crap around. That's all you're doing. Fixed point of attachment. Where is it? I'll do it again. Not that movement. This movement. Mom, you are not even trying, and I know you work out. You try. I'm like looking at him going, well, obviously those muscles work on him. No? Tell us, where's the fixed point? Backside. Okay, now that she's got you started, thank you. Where's the movable point that you have to pull on? On the back. Oh, you got it. Good. He got it. Good. This side, right? Some people want to attach it on the elbow. Can I wiggle this joint if I don't cross that joint? No, I have to wrap it around here and then pull on it, right? What is that muscle? Back here that does this? Triceps. That's the triceps. Okay. So now you know the biceps, right? So I'm going to show you what it does, and now you do the same thing. Fixed point of attachment, approximately. You don't have to get it perfect now. Where's the fixed point of attachment for the bicep? The one that doesn't move. Somewhere up here, you got it? Where's the movable point of attachment if you are not trying, you are failing? Try. Where is it? Where is it? Somebody point to it. Yes, you got it. It has to be down here. You have to cross the joint to move the joint, right? So basically, once you guys start working on muscles, they're going to be so damn hard. You need to have the logic to figure out what they should do before somebody tells you what they do, right? Because what they do ends up being really confusing. So you need to like put it there and go, that one should do that, right? Right? So one last question and I'll stop torturing you because you guys are loving this, I can tell. I'm going to do an action. And you guys are just going to tell me generally where the muscle is that is probably responsible for that action. You ready? This. Where is the muscle that's responsible for that? Totally got it. Here to here. Yes? Has to cross the hip, starts up here. This one stays still, goes past the hip, yanks. Good? Okay. So, once again, leverage for body movement. That's how you use your bones, as leverage for body movement. And then because muscles only pull, they never push, when you just start yanking stuff around and trying to figure out which direction it'll go, and then it starts to click. But it takes a little while, so I was just trying to give you a little heads up, because how many of you guys have Wednesday labs? Anybody? Okay. So they're ahead of all of the rest of you guys, and they're going, oh my God. What? Oh, it's after this. Oh, I see. Okay. So now I want to give you guys some tips for making studying the bones useful. Because anybody in here feel a little overwhelmed so far? Right? The rest of you are lying. Okay. And I did too, and I totally understand it. So first off, there are some ways that are more successful than other ways for studying the bones. I'm going to try to give you a little insight as to the ways that have been successful for many, many people. Is there a single way to study this? No. But there are some things that damn near never work. So let's go ahead and dump those, okay? And find some ways that do work. So first thing, is to try to get to the point that you actually understand the meanings of the words that you are using, okay? So this is really useful to you because you need to know that a facet, an alveolus, a fossa, and a foramen are all different things. And why? Because I'm going to run into something on a quiz or a test, and I'm going to be like, that's the mandibular, hell is it? But if you know that a fossa is a depression, then you can come up with the fact that that's the mandibular fossa and not the mandibular facet, even though they both start with F. Good? Okay? So the other thing is, once you have found, for instance, a fossa, go find a bunch of fossas until it starts looking like a fossa when you see one. The same thing when you did with epithelial tissue, right? At first you're like, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about, right? And now, can you not recognize an epithelial tissue even if you haven't seen it before, right? So that's what you need to do. If you run into a condyle, you go, okay, a condyle is a rounded projection, kind of looks like a knuckle, right? Let me go find a whole bunch of condyles until I start knowing what a condyle looks like, right? And then after I know what a condyle looks like, if there's something sticking off the side, it doesn't surprise me if that's the epicondyle because it's on the condyle. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that investment in learning the meanings of these words will make you be the person who can, of course, write down the name out of your head because you guys know that your lab practical is fill in the blank with no word bank, right? So you have to be able to come up with the words. And it takes a little while, right? But there are ways that are helpful. So you start to learn the names of these words, all of them. What's the difference between a trochanter, a tubercle, and a tuberosity, right? And there are different things. And then, of course, after you've found them, you go find examples of them, right? And then the next thing, and all of the lab instructors are supposed to be getting more consistent on this, is that you have to parent the feature to the bone. Okay, so let's talk about this one for just a second. So a process is a sticky off thing. Well, that's cool. Okay? But this is called the what process? Zygomatic process. But you need to parent it to the bone that it belongs to because it's really not the zygomatic process. It's the zygomatic process of the left temporal bone. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, why are we forcing you to do that? For a couple of different reasons. First off, it makes it so that if an instructor labeled this an asked feature, you would know the answer, but also if they labeled that an asked bone, you would know the answer. Correct? Because you know which features belong to which bone. It also eventually makes you get a 3D image of the boundaries of the bone in your head. It takes a little while to clarify, but it actually eventually does happen, right? And in addition, it helps you with memory because you will know, okay, eventually you don't get to label that without saying what bone it's part of. So that's the what? This guy right here. Styloid process of the, be more specific, of the left temporal bone. Styloid process of the left temporal bone, right? So there's no trick questions if you parent the bones, okay? We have asked all of the lab instructors to get in line and all of them to require parenting. If you do not parent a feature to the bone, half credit, okay? If it's just a bone, there's no parenting required because it's just, okay, I just asked the bone and I said that was the left temporal bone and you're totally cool. Do you understand? So parenting, and it takes practice, but what I will do to help you is make you miss it on a quiz, yeah? And then you won't miss it again because I'll give you guys a bone quiz starting next week. And I will put zygomatic process for sure. and you might choose it. And you'll get it wrong because you didn't choose zygomatic process of the left temporal bone. But then if you miss it on the quiz, are you going to miss it on the test? No, right? You pretty much just have to have that experience one time, even if I told you already that you were going to have it. Sometimes it just has to get in there, right? So that's important. The parenting thing is really important. They're all supposed to require it. And there's no way to trick you if you are actually parenting them. Oh, one last little thing about processes before we actually move to the next tip. And the next tip is that, I don't know if you've learned this about processes or pokey things, like I mentioned. And they're usually named either for their shape. Like this is the styloid process because it's shaped like a stylus, pointy. This is the mastoid process because it's shaped like a boob. Okay, everybody good? Also because that attaches to some of the mastoid muscles. But sometimes processes are named for what they're pointing toward. So somebody tell me why this one is called what it's called. The zygomatic process of the left temporal bone because it's pointing toward or connecting to the zygomatic bone. And what's this one called right here? No, what's the feature called? It's called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, right? All of that can be super duper confusing until you try to figure out why it's called that. So for me, I'm a why person. I'm terrible at memorizing things. If there isn't a why to it, I won't retain it. So I run into situations, and maybe you guys too do too. For those of you who have been to lab this week, there is a radial groove that runs right down the frickin' front of the humerus bone. It doesn't even go to the radial side. And you're like, what the hell? Why is that called the radial groove? I thought I had this crap. Well, if you ask somebody, they will tell you that that's where the radial artery runs, right? And then it clicks, and then you can hold on to it a little better. So always be brave enough to ask for some clarification, maybe some etymology, the meaning of the word, and then it can stick a little better for you. Unless you're just a person who hates words, then you do you, whatever that works for you. Okay. I always have to know why things are called that. Okay, so now let's some tips for learning the bones. If you were looking at any bone, you have to be able to figure out how it would be positioned in a person, right? And the way that I like to do this, again, there are a million ways to do it, is if you start with any bone, and this one is easy as hell, right? Any bone. First, you need to be able to tell if the person, where's the person's head, where's the person's feet, right? Where's the left side, right side? Are they face up or face down? So how do you do that? Well, with every bone that you run into, you have to be able to tell whether you're looking at the front side or the back side. And to do that, you have to find a really dependable anterior or posterior landmark. You don't need both, right? Because if you memorized an anterior landmark and you can't see it, you're looking at the back side, right? Okay. So for me, anybody have one for this bone yet? Like what anterior or posterior landmark you look for? No? Go ahead. Uh-huh. The bump that's on the front that you're trying to learn the name of, that's one of them. The way that I do it with this bone is that if I'm looking at the front side of it, it's just the shape of the bone, because the bone actually is a rainbow if you're looking at the anterior, and you can tell that bone came from femur, right? If it had any arch, it would be an anterior arch. If I'm looking at the back side of it, it's a smile, right? Okay. You can do whatever the hell you want for memory back versus front side. It's going to be different for every bone, right? Okay. So you have to have an anterior, posterior landmark, and then you have to have a medial or lateral landmark. What would you use for a medial or lateral landmark on this one, maybe? Which one? What? I'd use the head. Yeah? Because the head is ginormous and you can't miss it, right? And the head is what? Medial, yes? And then you have to be able to tell either superior and inferior, or in this instance, proximal and distal, right? So what's my proximal landmark for this one? The head too. So now, by looking at this, can anybody tell me which bone this is now? On which side? It's the right one, right? Okay. I'm looking at the anterior surface. This is medial, that's proximal, that's the right bone. But you have to get to know the bone well enough to do that. And it doesn't matter which landmark you use as long as it's really dependable on multiple iterations of the bone, okay? please do remember that we have articulated skeletons too, right? If you can't figure out how the hell this thing fits, and you will with this one, but the fibula, everybody gets confused with the fibula. You're like, what am I looking at? Go ask the articulated skeleton, because his is in the right place. Go say, George, what do you got for me, bro? And he'll be like, here you go, right there, okay? And then look at it. Okay, so anterior, posterior, lateral, medial, or proximal or distal. That will help position the bone. After you position the bone, you figure out where the person is, right? You empathize and you go, okay, that person was standing up. This person is laying that way, whatever, right? And then the next step is when you're studying next. There are a couple of different layers of studying that you have to do. Your first layer of studying, touch it, flip it around, do whatever. Your second layer of studying is you have to realize that at some point you won't be able to touch it. So you're going to have to learn from multiple positions. No matter how somebody puts it down, you're going to have to be able to figure out which side it is, right? It's really hard to do at first, but after a little while, it's not as hard. So you either go to the library here, you go to the STEM Center at Redwood, and you pull out a box of bones. And the best thing to do is pull it out with people. You pull it out, put it down on the table, whatever the hell, however you want, right? And then she has to answer questions with it in that position, because that's how your lab practical goes. With your lab practical, do not expect to be able to pick up the bones and move them. Okay? Why? Does it torture you? No, because if he picked up the bones, then she gets a different question, right? And she gets a different question, right? Because it's not in the same position. They also knock off the labels, make it more or less difficult for the next person. So generally speaking, you don't get to pick up the bones. You can sometimes ask the lab instructors or the lab aides to help you with it, right, if you need to. But just know that the second level of studying is being able to do it in whatever position it is. And then don't forget that you have a cheat sheet for some things all the time. This is the mastoid process. I can feel it on myself. This is the lateral malleolus of the fibula bone. This is the medial malleolus of the fibula bone. I can feel the styloid process. I can use my body. I can know head, manubrium, xiphoid process on my sternum, right? I can actually touch this person. Nobody can take this away from you. These are the anterior superior iliac spines. This is my iliac crest, right? Whenever you can palpate something, although it seems stupid, the more senses you involve with the process of memorization, the more likely you are to have retrieval, right? I even have, I didn't show you this. This is really cool. I have some students who draw all over themselves. It's really cool. Let's see if I can find it for you. Oh, there it is. Can't figure out all my carpal bones. Draw the damn things on there, right? You can carry them around with you. You can't carry them into the test, but you could wear them for a week very easily. You'd be like, I wonder where those damn bones are, right? I have my middle schoolers. I volunteer teach middle school science every Friday, and they drew all over each other, and they're so artistic. Those kids, man, kids are talented. So they drew all over each other. I let their parents know beforehand. Kids draw on themselves anyway. It might be something useful, right? Usually it's just a penis. Not that penises aren't useful, but we were not studying penises because it's Utah and you're not allowed to. Okay, and then last thing, and this is where people really, really get tired and stop doing it. You don't know lateral malleolus of the fibula until you can write lateral malleolus of the fibula. Does that make sense to you? You have to write. And you're not ready to do it yet, but before you get to your practical, you need to get to the point where if you two were studying together and you pull out something and point to it, he doesn't just get to say it, he has to write it. Because you're never going to be able to spell it if you can't write it, if you've never written it before. And some people go into the practical and they've never even tried to write those words before, and it doesn't go very well. Right? So you have to actually try to get to the point that you're confident. And all of these are just these levels of studying. In my experience, what happens with anatomy and the lab material is that the first time all you get is a teeny bit of information, right? The second time you go through it, you add to it. The third time you start understanding a little bit of meaning. And then the fourth time you can actually put it together with other things, right? So it's gonna get easier. right? Next week will be appendicular muscles is the hardest week of the semester in lab. Not in lecture. Lecture, nervous system is hardest, but we don't do the hard things at the same time, so you'll be all right, okay? So everybody okay? Anybody think about dropping this week or last week? No? Oh, good. I'm glad. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to back up and we're going to talk to you about what your bones are made of and how you got to have a skeleton at all. Embryological development of the skeleton, how all that kind of stuff works, what bones are made of. So first, let's talk about the actual structure of bones. But we already kind of know this because we know that bone is a connective tissue, right? Connective tissues all have cells, fibers, and extracellular matrix or ground substance, right? Cells, fibers, and ground substance. Good? Okay. All we need to do is to be very specific about what kinds of cells, what kinds of fibers, and what's in the ground substance in this tissue. But we've already done a decent amount of it. So as far as the organic component of bone, counterintuitively, bone is mostly not organic. And by organic, I mean either cells or a product of cells, carbon-containing living things or something that was made by carbon-containing living things. So organic components are the cells and the collagen fibers that were made by the cells. But that's only 35% of the bone. 65% of your bones is actually inorganic material that you could get from a rock if you licked the right rock. Yeah? And it's mostly calcium crystals, like ionic compounds of calcium, okay? And so these are like mineral salts. And remember the metaphor I told you guys about the matrix of bone? What was the metaphor I used? Matrix of bone is like what?
Trees.
No, the whole matrix. Like, how do I make it? Reinforced concrete, remember? Collagen fibers and calcium salts that you pour over them. So the concrete of the calcium salt is made primarily by these three different calcium compounds. As people get into their elderly years, a lot of times they either don't ingest or don't absorb enough calcium. And then postmenopausal women have trouble with calcium. So a lot of times they'll take calcium supplements. You can buy all three of these types of calcium supplements, and interestingly, some of the types are like $5 a bottle for, I don't remember how many milligrams, let's say 80 milligrams per pill or whatever, maybe 500. And then another type is $35 a bottle for the same number of milligrams. And the difference is primarily because you absorb some forms of calcium so much better than you absorb other forms of calcium. But of course, if you're on a budget, you got a pension, which one are you going to buy? You're going to buy the $5 one. Go ahead.
So you're saying the calcium is the rebar or the calcium?
No, the calcium is the concrete. Yes, it crystallizes. It's a mineral and it crystallizes around the collagen fibers. Yeah, and there's several different kinds of calcium. Now, most of us don't take calcium supplements at this point in our lives. Most of us actually just get adequate amounts of calcium from our diet. But as you age, your diet tends to suffer, right? In addition, postmenopausal women have some calcium challenges that I'll talk to you guys about. Okay, so that's the inorganic components. And then let's go back to the organic components. Well, the collagen fibers, right? Okay, but then also what kind of cells do we have? So let's talk about those cells. So most of these cells we've met before. So we talked about osteoblasts and osteocytes before, right? And we talked about osteoclasts before. But now let me tell you the whole bone story and add one more kind of cell. There's actually 4 different types of bone cells. These guys are the precursors to all bone cells. They are the ancestors or the progenitors of bone, and they are called osteoprogenitor cells. And they can make marrow or osteocytes, for instance. They don't make all of them. I said all, but that was half a fib. They make most, okay? So when this cell undergoes differentiation and maturation, it will become an osteoblast. And you met osteoblasts before. Osteoblasts do what? What does the name imply? Yeah, they build bone. Primarily what this guy is going to do is going to take all of those amino acids and calcium from your diet, yes? and it's going to make the amino acids into collagen fibers, right? And it's going to secrete the collagen fibers around it. Then it's going to take the calcium crystals that you ate, yeah? And it's going to make the concrete, and it's going to dump it around it until it ends up being completely surrounded. When it is completely surrounded, it can chill, and it becomes an osteocyte. Yes? So these are 3 different stages of the same cell. Yeah? So when it's completely surrounded, it's not like it does nothing, but it did most of its job, so it can just do repair here and there, right? So the osteocyte is completely surrounded. It's still sitting in a little pocket. What's the little pocket called? Lacuna. And I'll show you what the lacuna actually looks like with a different type of microscopy, because this is really cool. If you use light microscopy, you can just see the cells and everything, but if you use scanning electron microscopy, see the little dips? Kills off the cells and just like gets the scanning the surface of it, and you can see the lacuna, which is kind of cool. Okay, so then the other type of cell is the osteoclast that you have met before. It's not a part of this life cycle. It's still derived from mesenchyme, still derived from the same kind of stuff. But it's more like a macrophage than it is anything like this, only the only thing it really eats is bone matrix. So it's a multinucleated cell, kind of looks like a big old macrophage. And what it will do is, what does clast mean? To destroy or break down. What it will do is, when necessary, it will actually break down the bone matrix, dump the calcium and the amino acids into your bloodstream, right? And why would it do that? Well, that woman who was 85 and wasn't taking in enough calcium but still wanted to run her nervous system and clot her blood and run her heart, these guys actually dump it into her bloodstream to keep her alive, right? Or if you start working out, you need to change the shapes of your bones, because the attachment points will be deeper in some places, the projections will be higher in some places, and osteoclasts have the capacity to change the shapes of your bones and remodel them. Does that make sense? So we have osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteoprogenitor cells, and then osteocytes are more the ones in like mature bones, like in the middle. Everybody okay with that? Okay. So now, I want to look at the structure of a long bone, which you guys should be doing in lab starting today, Wednesday to Tuesday of next week. You guys should be doing both studying all long bones and also doing a long bone dissection from a cow long bone. And it's not like the most interesting dissection in the world, but it is actually kind of cool because you can see the tissues not just that make up the bone, but that also wrap around the bone and fill the middle of the bone. So first I want to define a long bone for you, okay? So long bone means something specific. Yes, of course this is a long bone. It's the longest bone in the body. But that's not what long bone means. Long bone means a bone that is longer than it is wide, okay, and is roundish in cross-section. Yes? So of course the femurs are long bones, but so is the fibula and the tibia, right? And my carpals aren't long bones. Those are actually short bones. But my metacarpals and my phalanges are, even though they're not that long. That makes sense? Now the ones that where it gets kind of confusing is the ribs are longer than they are wide, but they're what in cross-section? They're kind of flat, yeah. Flat in cross-section? Yeah, yeah, almost square. So these typically aren't considered long bones. So long bones, mostly limbs. Yeah, mostly limbs. Not carpals, not tarsals, but most of your limbs are actually long bones. And don't worry, I don't like try to trick you on what I mean by long bone, generally speaking. So this is, of course, the femur, which is a long bone. But long bones have some specific characteristics. All of them do. They vary in attachment sites and all of that kind of stuff. But if you're looking at any long bone, first off, because they're mostly associated with the limbs, they're going to have a top and a bottom, but we don't call it superior and inferior. We call it proximal and distal. Yeah? And the proximal and distal points are called epiphyses. Singular is epiphysis. So a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. You will hate the epiphyses because they have all kinds of little depressions and bumps that you need to learn, which will seem completely arbitrary until later when we hook a muscle to it or run a blood vessel through it, right? So that's the proximal and distal epiphyses. And then through the middle, you of course have the diathesis. Dia means through. So what does epi mean? On or upon through the middle, okay? Also, diathesis is also called the shaft. Is that okay? So the proximal and distal epiphyses and the diathesis. Okay, so let me tell you something cool about the epiphyses and the epiphyseal line. Okay, in this picture it's really hard to see, so let's look at this one. There is, at some point in the epiphyses of any long bone, an interruption of sort of the pattern of spongy bone on the inside, if you could cut it open. You with me so far? Do you see that interruption? That is called the epiphyseal line in an adult, okay? In a subadult, which is in males, you can grow until you're around 25, and females, you usually stop between 19 and 22, okay? If you are a subadult, instead of having this be completely ossified and sealed, it will still be open. It will still be cartilaginous. It will be called the epiphyseal plate, yeah, or the growth plate. As long as the growth plate isn't sealed, the long bone can still get longer and you can still get taller. Does that make sense? So, in an adult, this is not cartilaginous. In an adult, that is bony, and in a subadult, it's cartilaginous. So that's called the epiphyseal plate or the epiphyseal line. This ends up being interesting in like forensic situations. So in forensic situations, right, if I find a dried bone like this, I can immediately, well, first I have to make sure it's human, which isn't very hard, okay? I can immediately start narrowing down the age of this person because the epiphysis is not completely connected to the diathesis. So I know that this person is a subadult, and then if I'm a really good forensic anthropologist, then what I actually know is which bones seal in which orders, right? So you can tell by which bones are sealed and which aren't an age range for the person. And then the sex is really easy to determine. Ethnicity gets harder and harder all the time because we're all just a bunch of mutts. But it's still not impossible to get some idea of ethnicity. So this is interesting. It's also interesting, I don't know if any of you guys hunt or used to hunt, but I obviously came from a redneck family, so we did a hell of a lot of hunting. If you find bones out in, not human, right? If you find bones out in the forest when you're hunting, you can tell whether it was an adult or a subadult because usually this gets carried off by a predator because they're actually not even attached to one another, right? Just like gets carried off. Okay. All right, so that's the epiphysis and the diathesis. It's called an epiphyseal line when it's closed. We'll talk about when it's open a little later. And then inside the diathesis in most long bones is what we call a medullary cavity or a marrow cavity. So the epiphyses are actually made of mostly spongy bone with compact bone around the edges. The diathesis is made of compact bone, a little bit of spongy bone in it, and then marrow, or marrow in the medullary cavity. So let's look at a couple of that. So this is a dried bone, okay? And you can actually see the medullary cavity right here, okay? This is compact bone at the edges, so almost the entire diathesis is made of compact bone. It's going to be really strong, but it's also really heavy. So one of the ways that you can make it lighter and still have the structural integrity of the outside is to fill it with a softer tissue called marrow, okay? And the marrow will let you store a few things too. But when you get to the diatheses, all of your diatheses are spongy bone in the middle, but you never ever leave spongy bone around the outside. So why would you not want spongy bone on the outside of the bone? Because it's really like you have to hook stuff to it, right? Does that look like it's good to hook something to? No. So you always have compact bone around the outside and then spongy bone to greater and lesser degrees. And even these guys, can you see that there's a little bit of spongy bone in the inside? But it's just mostly compact bone, right? Mostly compact bone. Okay, so I have the diathesis and the medullary cavity. In an adult, the medullary cavity contains yellow marrow, and yellow marrow is really mostly fat storage, okay? When you are growing, it contains greater and lesser degrees of red marrow because a 3-year-old is going to need to make more blood cells than an adult, right? So as I get to be an adult, I primarily just have to maintain the volume of blood that I already have. But when I'm 3, I have to make a hell of a lot more blood because I got a lot more body to build, right? So as an adult, this will contain yellow marrow in most of us. Okay, and then you should be able to see this if you do the long bone dissection. The long bone dissection will show you, if you look up a little closer, that there's actually a membrane wrapping around the outside of the bone, and then there's a membrane around the inside of the bone. The membrane wrapping around the outside of the bone is called periosteum. Does that make sense to you? Periosteum is 2-layered. You already know what the outer layer is made of. The outer layer is made of something that you can yank on from any damn direction, and it should stay pretty stable. What is that? Dense, irregular connective tissue. So the outer layer of the periosteum that you're seeing right here, it's not drawn that well, or the fibrous layer or the superficial layer, that is made of dense, irregular connective tissue, okay? But the inner layer, we haven't learned yet. You didn't learn this tissue. The inner layer smashes right up against the bone and can actually remodel the bone. So the inner layer is osteoblast, osteoclast, and osteoprogenitor cells. And it allows you to remodel the bone from the outside. Good? But we don't want to yank on it, right? So we put dense irregular connective tissue around the outside. We yank on that, and then we put the cells actually right next to the bone. That make sense? Okay. And then the inner layer wrapping around the medullary cavity is called endosteum. Everybody okay with that? Endosteum. Do you yank on endosteum? No, so you don't need dense irregular connective tissue. It's just the cells. Endosteum is just made of osteoblast, osteoclast, and osteoprogenitor cells. But let's back up a little bit and talk about the fact that endosteum doesn't just wrap around the medullary cavity. I want you to understand that the endosteum wraps around every single space within this spongy bone, every single space. That gives you a lot of access to spongy bone. So I want you to think about that 85-year-old woman again, okay? Her calcium is really low in her diet. She's having a lot of trouble maintaining her bone mass. Her osteoclast start to break things down, right? What can they get at best? Compact bone or spongy bone? Spongy bone. So they start breaking down her spongy bone. They start breaking down her spongy bone, for instance, in her ilium, yeah? And she loses the structural integrity of the spongy bone of the ilium. The outer surface still looks fine. It's not even really pockmarked, but the inner structural integrity of her ilium is compromised, and then she falls. And then a 25-year-old person, when they fall, do they break their hip? No, but an 85-year-old woman with even pre-osteoporosis can fall and break her hip because you lose the structural integrity simply because you have access to all of that because of the endosteum. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's how the endosteum works. And then at the end of every single long bone, do you see that? It's usually drawn that color, like a bluish gray right there. And it is here too. It's harder to see in this picture, but here is what we call articular cartilage. At the ends of your long bones, we have articular cartilage. That's not telling you the tissue type. That's telling you its function. What does articular mean? Joints. Okay. And the most common tissue type you use to make articular cartilage is what? Most common cartilage. Hyaline. Yeah, it's almost always hyaline. There are exceptions, but it's almost always hyaline cartilage. Yeah? Hyaline cartilage at the ends. Okay? So that is your articular cartilage. And you're going to run into these in all of your bones. Now, unless it's a fresh bone, like the cow bone that you're dissecting, you won't see the cartilage because the cartilage just dries up and falls off. Does that make sense? Okay. So you'll only see that on fresh bones. Okay. So I'm going to let you guys go a few minutes early today because you're a little bit ahead of the other class, and we'll pick up right here on Monday. You have a quiz due, right? It's due tomorrow. I would make sure it's already done. If you are Seth, you go through and answer them all first, and then you don't have to worry about it, and you just fix them later, right? You can fix them later, but at least you already did them. Wouldn't it just hurt your heart to know that it was basically free money and you just left it sitting there? I never actually found any free money. doesn't ever seem to be free, right? There's always some catch.